Coronas actually do quite a good job of knitting Fairisle, but they do it in a somewhat unusual way. And I'm going to do it in a more unusual way because the instructions in the manuals that I have read are not the easiest thing to take in. So I'm going to show you a way that works with the capacities of the machine. And there are others, and we'll explore them later. We work with the TC lever set to C, both feeders threaded with colors of yarn, both SAM buttons on A, and both number dials set on 4. Side levers are on number 2. We will then select the needles by pulling back 1 and 2 in this case, and we'll knit with that selection and the same color for 2 rows. So the same yarn feeder stays in place. With the settings that we're using, when you pull back needles 1 and 2, you are actually selecting them to slip. It's the forward needles that are going to knit, and the positioning of the needles will be repeated all the way across the row. In this case, I'm selecting needles 1 and 2, using gray for 2 rows, and then we'll change to pink. For the pink, use needles 3 and 4, and do that for 2 rows. Watch the 2 yarns closely to make sure that they do not tangle. When one of the needles that you need to select is on the very end, in this case I think my number 3 is on the end, I find it helps to not only select that, but push the needle that represents number 3 into the back position the next time it occurs in the repeat also. I get better performance this way. The machine does listen even away from the very first number 3 needle. It's just a little bit of insurance in case that first needle got tugged perhaps by the yarn tension and didn't quite understand what you meant. Here I'm going across really slowly and trying to show you how the needles are being selected. Those that are repeats of the ones we did not push back are coming forward and grabbing stitches. So let's turn this into a hat pattern that has a Fairisle enhanced brim. Normally the machine is perfectly happy running these 2 yarns side by side to make the equivalent of a fingering yarn. For Fairisle, I'm changing to the single gray as the background color and the single coral as the contrast color, partly because there's not really room on the table to allow them all a direct drop if I use multiple combs, and it makes the yarn feeding uneven. Also, Fairisle just behaves better without composite yarns in my experience. When it's time for color 2, thread the contrast color yarn feeder and snap it into position. Your hat will come out slightly different from this one because I've tweaked the numbers since I worked on this one. Your Fairisle pattern will be more centered on the length of the hem. That's the difference. You'll be knitting the inside of the hem first, so you can't actually see it in this picture. At main stitch size -1, for me that's 7, knit 14 rows. The remaining 16 rows of the hem will be the outside of the hem, although the fold may not occur exactly there, but pretty much. Still at stitch size 7, or your main stitch size -1, knit 4 more rows, and these fall here. Turn the stitch dial up 1 whole number, and using the color 1, gray in my case, knit 2 rows, having selected stitches 1 and 2. Now make sure your contrast color is threaded into feeder 2, engage feeder 2, and we'll knit 2 rows of pink. It's going to take 8 passes with the carriage following these instructions to get the first 4 rows of the little squares side by side. Select 1 and 2, knit 2 rows of gray. Select 3 and 4, knit 2 rows of pink. Again, select 1 and 2, knit 2 rows of gray, 3 and 4, 2 rows of pink. Now to turn the squares into checks instead of vertical stripes, we do the whole operation again, but after the final row of pink at numbers 3 and 4 needles, we don't change to color gray. We knit on needles, having selected needles 1 and 2, still using the color pink. Then select needles 3 and 4, changing to gray, knit 2 rows. Number 1 and 2, knit 2 rows of pink. Numbers 3 and 4, knit 2 rows of gray. And we have completed 8 rows of Fairisle. It took 16 passes with the carriage. Finish up the hem with 4 plain rows of gray. Now we'll just go ahead and hang this hem as we always do. The yarn tails may be tucked right inside of the hem. And what we'll have is a nifty Fairisle hem with no floats to get entangled with on the inside of the hat. The remainder of the hat is exactly like the stockinette version, 56 rows, then gather up and seam the edges together. If you need extra help with that, there is an entire video on finishing. I do have a couple of finer points for you. Here's what you can do if you have a jam and the needles go all cattywampus, as mine just did. We're far enough into the hat, you'd really kind of hate to lose it now. If it's possible to see which needles the machine was pulling forward, pull them all the way forward. The probable cause of the problem was that yarn did not knit off neatly into stitches for the last couple of stitches, so you will need to fix those manually and adjust the tension of them manually. Also, manually make sure that the 2 yarns are not tangled in each other's way. By some mysterious mechanism, the machine seems to interpret this correctly all the way across the bed, and the row knits as intended. When there is an issue with tangles and jams, it's usually caused right here. It's super important to have the tension masts perfectly adjusted. We don't want slack like this developing, but the machine is also intolerant of too snug of tension. That causes the last couple stitches to fail to knit off evenly, and that will cause future jam. And one more little tip. The Fairisle makes an adorable accent to an otherwise plain hat, and it really does work better with 2 single yarns of the correct weight. But if those are in short supply, just use them for the brim. On this hat, I changed back to my composite yarn for the hat crown to conserve the true fingering yarns for future projects. This hat is part of an entire series on knitting with Corona knitting machines that you may also enjoy.